Okay, thank you very much, Azish, and welcome to the Africa Center's program, which is now called Africa's Contemporary Security Challenges. And what we're trying to do with this program is to interrogate some of the wicked problems that you're going to be facing as you interact with your African colleagues and you interact with your service and interagency colleagues who have responsibility for Africa. And so it's going to be slightly different from usual, because we're not going to be, or I'm not going to be telling you about accountability and governance. I'm going to try and lead a conversation that would respond to what I believe matter to you the most. And if I'm not getting there, I'm sure you would let me know. I have a presentation that focuses on accountability and governance in Africa's security sector. But I'm more than happy, since I have my dear colleague Azish here, if we want to broaden or deepen at any point, I'll do so gladly, because he's here to back me up with any difficult questions that you may have. What I want to do is start with some definitions, because generally when we talk about accountability and governance, there is some murkiness, but exactly what are we talking about? When you say corruption, exactly what are we talking about? So I want to start with some definitions. And then to provide context to the definitions, I'll talk to you about something that's a program that was implemented in Liberia in the early 2000s, called the Governance and Economic Management Assistance Program, because the focus there was accountability and governance. Then I want to talk about strategic issues. If we agree on a definition and we can take some lessons from the case studies, then what next? What do we do with it? What should our African colleagues be doing about it? And what impact does this have not just on the nature of the security sector, but security sector outcomes writ large? Is there a connection? And then I'll end with my crystal ball and soapbox and give you a few of my personal thoughts. So let's start with definitions. When we think about the accountability and governance space, two words generally come up. Dr. Malikesh and I were in Lusaka, Zambia, a couple of months ago. Or was it 3 months ago? Yeah, let's just say in the recent past. We were in Lusaka, Zambia, talking about, the management of resources in Africa's security sector. And one of the representatives from a country, a lady, and I've already flouted a non-attribution law I've attributed to gender. A lady said, transparency and accountability are like a song to us. It's something we need to sing for the donors. And that's the reality. When you hear accountability and transparency, what does it mean practically in a security sector context? Let's start with transparency. What does transparency mean to you? If you're talking to an African colleague and you're saying transparency, it's in all our documents. Transparency, accountability. What does transparency mean? From a purely dictionary perspective, transparency means it's not opaque. You can see through it. Okay? And generally, when we talk about transparency, we say it needs to be open. It needs to be accessible to the public. That is being transparent. Uganda, the public procurement office in Uganda, the government's public procurement office, has a website. And on that website, they have the audits they conduct of government departments and ministries. They post it on the website. Is Uganda transparent, being transparent in doing that?
Anybody could put anything on a website.
This is a government institution. It's audited by an auditing firm. It's up there.
Yeah, that's the
Still.
appearance of openness.
Still, what he said, anyone can put anything up there they can get away with putting up, depending if the government allows it to be put up there.
Okay.
Or
Let's
to be put up.
let's just say, for the sake of this, and for the little I know about what goes on behind, it's done by a reputable accounting company, and it's audited according to international accounting standards, and it is up there.
Yeah, sounds like
It sounds good, transparent,
Is
an open, available.
part of transparent.
That,
exactly what I was looking for. That's part of transparency.
yeah.
So we run into this kind of like quagmire very quickly when we approach these discussions with a little fuzziness in definition. What about accountability? What does that mean? Different for people. When you say we want accountability in the security sector.
And oversight.
Oversight?
Being held responsible.
That's right. In
Financial control?
Financial control, one more?
in punitive actions for the breach of that, or some kind of
Responsibility.
punitive, yeah.
No.
Yeah.
Consequences.
You get fired, you get jailed, pay a
Yeah.
fine, whatever.
Accountability. Okay. For me, the first question is accountability to whom?
People that you represent. Above.
You weren't voted in, you're a civil servant. Or you're sworn in as a uniformed officer. And most of the oaths on the continent, you swear allegiance not to the people,
To the Constitution.
to the Constitution. And the Constitution is embodied in the government of the day, the administration. So to whom should the security sector be accountable? Accountability to whom? And then who is accountable? Is an institution as accountable as an individual? There's a lot of research into this topic. The reason I'm posing these questions is not to waste time, but it's to challenge you to think through this. Because I believe that until and unless we could address this issue of accountability of individuals and institutions, and for my money, accountability should be to the people. And in most of these countries, accountability is to whomever is providing the funding for what activity is being done. And this is where you guys come in. Because most times their eyes are not on the people or on a strategic analysis of what the threats and challenges are within the countries. It becomes a donor game. As the lady quite rightly said, it has become a song we sing to the donors. So if we are to be effective in our engagements, in our programs, and if we are to be impactful, because a lot of what we want in the security sector requires not just a change of policy, it requires a change of, I think you mentioned it, the process, how business is done in the security sector. And we cannot make much progress if we don't have a reduction of the opaque nature of this animal that is the security sector, and we don't understand this basic thing about accountability. Because I have a slide, and I'll go into this a little bit later, that the foundation of this analysis is social contract theory. And quite often, in our desire to get things done, or in our desires to keep our burn rates up, we circumvent the social contract between the people and their governments. And it becomes more difficult for them to pay attention to what matters the most, and more difficult for them to actually take the initiative, or no, I'll do it. So, why is this difficult at times? It's difficult in general because there are weak institutions, bad governance, etc. But there are some things that make the security sector peculiar. You talk to most professionals on the continent, why is there not so much transparency? And why is accountability so difficult? The first thing they'll say, oh, well, it's confidential, it's restricted, it's classified. And the thing that, the reason why it was interesting to start with the definitions is that even if something is confidential, you need to have systems in place to ensure that there is effective oversight. So there's accountability to a parliamentary subcommittee, accountability to an oversight committee, or in the case of Uganda, accountability to an international accounting firm. So even if it is confidential, it need not be secret. The second problem is most countries are facing what I call the tyranny of the urgent. There are like 10 fires to put out at the same time. They don't have time to be transparent. They don't have time to meet all the accountability standards. Okay, this is where the process becomes important again. And there are a number of other challenges, some of which I have listed here. But let me provide you with some context and tell you a quick story. Okay, no, before I tell you the story. Transparency International, how many people have heard of Transparency International? They are an international watchdog type organization. And for my money, they have done the best job of breaking down what corruption means in the security sector. And I have the website up there, visit it, for I think 84 or 85 countries, and including many on the African continent. They have detailed rankings of how the countries rate when it comes to political corruption risk, financial corruption risk, human resource management risk, the nepotism, etc., operational risk, and procurement risk. And I think what I like about this is, for the first time in a long time, we have not a perfect index, because I've been around numbers long enough in my life to know that there's no such thing as a perfect index, but at least you have an analytical framework to engage. So sitting across the table with an African official or discussing oversight in Africa, tossing the word corruption out is meaningless. But if you're able to point and say, as regards this type of corruption risk, here are some of your shortfalls. Then it starts to gain some traction. Then you're going somewhere. Then you're able to identify points of engagement and leverage. This is a combination of perceptions and interviews with officials. So they actually go in country and interview some officials. They have researchers in the various countries. But here's where it gets interesting. If you go to the this is the 2014 data showing, how countries rank. As you can see, most countries in the world are on the wrong side of a B grade. But what's happening now, and what I find most interesting and what I actually recommend to you, is that on the website, countries are beginning to respond to their country reports. And I would ask you to look at Tunisia, if you can. If you're interested, you go to the website, pull down the Tunisian response. Because what I like about the Tunisian response, it goes chapter and verse and says, you say this, here's what we have. You say we don't have a law for procurement, here is our law. So we don't have a process, this is how it works. And for me, that is critically important, because you are already starting to get this conversation going. And countries are paying attention, and if you tell a country you are corrupt, they'll say, so are you, and walk away. But if you tell a country, I think that deal you did last month wasn't signed, they could say, yeah, it was. Here it is. Or if they don't produce evidence, then that in itself is evidence. So that's the kind of conversation that we need to have to understand this accountability and governance challenge a little bit more. Let me tell you a quick story about Liberia. How many people know about the war in Liberia? How many people have watched the movie Blood Diamonds? That's fiction, you know that, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm just joking. It is largely true. But
Prince Johnson with drinking Budweiser was for real, though.
it was for real.
Yes.
Yes.
No,
There are many things that are for real that are really scary in that movie, but after a lot of that scary thing happened, and they completely destroyed what was once a prosperous middle-income country, we end up in 2003. And the people of Liberia were tired of the war. International community was also tired of seeing this war on TV. And so they decided we're going to do something, and they had what was called the National Transitional Government of Liberia, NTGL. They put in charge of the national government a hodgepodge of former fighters, failed politicians, but like a coalition of the unwilling. Put them together and said, govern this country for a transition period, then we'll have elections. Bad idea. Because they knew that they're not a political force. And they had 2 years to govern the transitional government before they all go their separate, hopefully merry ways, and a government comes in. So what was noticed is, and I don't know why the international community was surprised, they said, we're going to set up this government, we're going to give you boatload of money. Money is going to fix your problems. But they noticed that the money was coming in and the money was going out and nothing was being done. And they thought, what are we going to do? So then they decided to concoct this thing called the Governance and Economic Management Program of Liberia. It focused on trying to stop lack of transparency and have a sense of accountability in Liberia's public sector. It was introduced in 2003. Introduced in 2003, it was actually shepherded by USAID. It was negotiated, they got a Security Council resolution, and financed in less than 7 months. And that is remarkable. But what they did was they got Liberia, the government, to agree that, one, they're going to have co-signing agreements. Every invoice or every bill over a certain amount would require the Liberian minister or the Liberian general. They had no generals back then. In fact, they had no army. Nigerian official and someone appointed by the international community. Second thing was each ministry signed a management contract. We're going to agree to these standards of accountability and we're going to have a contract to do ABC. Third, they had a company and international USAID, ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, and the AU all agreed we're going to watch. And anyone caught pilfering was going to feel not just the full weight of Liberian law, they'll be banned from traveling, their children will be banned from schools abroad, etc. So this is what they decided to do. And before I go on, how successful do you think this was from a policy, from a transparency and accountability? perspective.
A good first start.
Good first start. Sorry?
Just gradual, it's supposed to be gradual process, is it not?
It's a gradual process, so a good start.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Any thoughts? If you think back to our definitions, accountability to whom? What we should have been doing back then was reconnecting the people, the citizens of Liberia, with those in positions of governance. We didn't do that. And so for most people, GMAP was just about the donors not wanting their money to be stolen. The whole issue of the performance contract, the whole issue of effects and impact was lost. And so for any transparency and accountability initiative to be impactful or useful or have a sustained effect, you need national or local ownership and buy-in. Didn't exist. It was just viewed as a project. And secondly, there wasn't really enough money to do GMAP across the public sector. So there were selected ministries that GMAP focused on. Defense, revenue generating ministries, the ports and the airports, land tenure. So what did any good public servant do? Find the ministry that's not being watched and have subcontracts with that ministry. So the process needs to be comprehensive. The process also needs to be what, I don't like the term, but for want of a better term, whole of government. Because any chain is only as good as as the weakest link. And so there are many weak links that were found. So while GMAP was definitely a good start, the start of a process, because it overlooked the important social contract issues, and also because it didn't really take into account some of the peculiarities of the security sector. Because back then, there was peace, meaning a piece of paper had been signed. You weren't seeing people driving down in trucks firing AK-47s in the air, but there was still a war going on in most of the country. And that was also something that had not been thought through. So the necessary oversight mechanisms were not put in place. And so is GMAP useful? I think it is, because I think it speaks to, in many ways it was a good start, but it also speaks to the importance of learning from a lot of our challenges, because Africa is a challenging environment. But most importantly, GMAP focused on the symptoms and not the root causes of corruption. The root causes of corruption are the perverse political economy. The root causes of corruption are regime security as a form of government, as a form of governance, and the another root cause of corruption is, impunity. Someone mentioned the importance of sanctions. I say that one thing that we need to invest in on the continent are prisons. There are not enough prisons, because you squeeze many people in, but that stigma lives with you and your family for a long time. So if people know they're going to jail, definitely it wouldn't solve it completely, but it would avoid it. And so these were some of the symptoms versus causes shortcomings with GMAP. And key lessons, I think you need both the domestic and external leadership. The short-term goals of staunching the theft of external support should have been linked to the longer-term goal of state building and institutional strengthening. And there should have also been a communication strategy. So people understand it's not just about aid being stolen, it's about a country that needed to be rebuilt. We've gone from state-centric security, which was the immediate post-independence. How do we protect this new baby we have inherited, aka the state? To regime security, when those to whom governance was bequeathed became monsters, and all became, how do I perpetuate my existence? To human security, the 1994 UNDP Human Development Report. So now we're looking more at citizen-centric security. But something happened midway. A lot of the odious regimes figured out that if they speak international donors' language, they'll be left alone. And so the concept of performance legitimacy, which China has, perfected domestically, is now rampant in African countries, where your legitimacy is not so much a function of how much you serve your people. Your legitimacy is derived by having built a road where there was no road, or a hospital where there was no hospital. You could be the worst dictator, but if you could perform by infrastructural investments, then you could also be corrupt. And so the system that we're working with now is not like a perfect democratic institution type milieu. It is, you have this impetus of performance legitimacy. And so with performance legitimacy, to whom are you accountable? And so that's one thing, performance legitimacy, the investment. But they've also figured out that with performance legitimacy, you need to have this thing called elections. And if you can get enough people to facilitate success for you, however it happens, and how many people are following what's going on in the Gambia right now? Yeah, it's not pretty. Today, the Economic Community of West African States sent a delegation of heads of state to talk sense to the president, and he insulted them individually and collectively. That's where we are. So, as long as you can find sufficient people who are your supporters and provide them with access and with quote-unquote security, you can check the elections box. It happens in Ethiopia with frightening regularity. It happens in Uganda with frightening regularity. And what that does, it undermines all the accountability and transparency efforts that you might want to engage in. So as long as the social contract, the top part, and at times I title this favorite thingy of mine, who pays the government? Because as long as the people as a whole and the companies with which they work are not sustaining the government's eyes are not, and attention is not going to be on the people. It's going to be on themselves first, and secondly on the sources of financial viability. And this happens to be us, the donor community, and natural resources. And so people will say, is this part of the resource curse? Is resource endowment in itself an issue in the corruption question? I would say yes, but because I think from this reduction of social contract theory, it is basically you need to get that top loop working again. And that's where the investments need to be made, and that's where a lot of our efforts need to be focused. And if we don't get that top loop working, and through performance legitimacy, the governments have divided the people effectively. And this is why a lot of elections are zero-sum, because it's not just about Yahya Jammeh in the Gambia. It's about his entire patrimonial or neo-patrimonial network. So, when you engage on the continent, or when you think about, okay, how do we handle this thing that is corruption? Cultural relativity comes into it. Is it expected? All right. Who are we to lord it over them and tell them what to do? How do you broach corruption? For me, I take the route that they themselves have come up with guiding principles for corruption at the African Union. So every time I'm discussing with Africans or African officials, or I'm in Africa discussing corruption, I start with the African Union Convention itself. So it's not coming from you. This is what African countries use. It's not a standard that the Americans want you to meet. It's a standard you set for yourself. How many people have read the African Union Convention? It's not very long. I would suggest you read it, because one of the things it does, people say, oh, how do you define corruption in Africa? You know, Africans, no. They have defined it themselves. It's in there. Refer them to it. It's a really good, point of departure for this conversation, because then it disarms the conversation. It's not so much about Major Who or Colonel Who or Doctor Who saying, boy, do we have a solution for you. You have a problem. It's about reminding them that they themselves have acknowledged that this problem exists, and there is a document that lists not just what corruption is, but steps that should be taken nationally and regionally. Because this I think provides you with a lot of the cover that you need to be able to have these difficult conversations. And they say, well, then how do we measure corruption? There's the index. If you disagree with the index, pull up the Tunisia rebuttal and say, well, why don't you do something like this? And then, it's more helpful to them than it is to us. Well, there's two things. One, if you have a bucket and the bucket has like 10 holes, and you patch up 5 of them, you still have a leaking bucket. It makes sense to have the investment and do it system-wide. GMAP should have been done system-wide for it to be effective. The second issue is that I think that there was this sense in which they just believed if we throw money at the problem, eventually it will trickle down to the people and all will be well. It never works that way. And that also became GMAP's undoing, and some of the post-election Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's first term, a lot of the post-election corruption issues started during the GMAP era. The people, you would be surprised how resilient people are, and how resilient they are when they believe that there is hope for them. There's a book called A Great Perhaps, which is about about Plan Colombia between 1999 and 2015. And what was done there, and how they got from almost 50 years of fighting to signing and adopting a peace deal. A critical part of phase 1 of Plan Colombia was focusing on quick gains and feel-good impact in the communities. And once people start thinking that, yeah, tomorrow is probably going to be brighter, they start paying attention and becoming more engaged. But not making an effort to integrate them, I think, was a lost opportunity. Which was why, if you looked at the elections results of the next 2 election cycles in Liberia. It's like you can draw a line, the divide. The pre-war divide was even more stark. And it's not just China. You have Eastern Europe. You have India. You have Brazil. You have Turkey. In fact, last week I was in Dakar, Senegal, and we had this conference in the most fabulous looking conference center. And the first question was that built by the Chinese? I said, no, by the Turks. So there are a lot of issues and currents, and if we could keep that for Thursday, we'll, drill deeper in that one. Any questions about definitions, the case, and the sense of the whole accountability and transparency issue? Okay, so what do we do about it? What do we do about it? There's a really interesting paper written by Gary Becker. He won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 1992, and he currently has a blog site. And he blogs on nothing but crime and economics. So if this is an area that is of interest to you, I'll encourage you to visit the blog site. But what I like about the paper is that he kind of breaks it down into what needs to be done. Okay, I know from a policy perspective, either foreign or security, we say, we're dealing with corrupt countries, corrupt regimes, corrupt individuals. Then what? You're going to arrest them? Or are you going to... But he kind of gives an analytical breakdown, which I like. But before that, his argument about, corruption being a rational choice. I think it's as important as our definitions on transparency and accountability earlier. Because it's not that this person just happened to be in hell, so he became the devil. It is, the person is looking at the environment in which he or she operates and says, on balance. And we do that here as well. On balance. There's something called transfer pricing. How many people have heard of transfer pricing? It's it's a very interesting accounting trick, which is perfectly legal. It's not illegal. It's basically tax avoidance. If you're a multinational, you're in country X, and you don't want to pay any taxes, you just transfer your books to somewhere where they don't pay taxes, and you claim 0 in the country you're operating in. To be able to do that, you have to have clever accountants, so you have to have officials who are complicit. Who can guess how much transfer pricing costs the African continent every year? By way of lost taxation.
Trillions.
No.
Billions.
Mm-hmm.
50 million. Big place.
It's a big place. But to put it in context, the amount of aid, foreign assistance that Africa receives every year, if you add it all up together, it's about $42 to $45 billion a year. You know how much transfer pricing costs Africa? Well, there's a range because economists made the estimate, and economists don't agree. Some have a low ball, some have a high ball. The low ball is about 60 billion. The high ball is about 110 billion every year. And most of that happens not necessarily because you have bad guys being corrupt. It's because of something they call the high value, low frequency contracting. Whether you're thinking infrastructure or supplies or mining or big agriculture, for the bidding country, that's a make or break deal for them. So they would sell their nearest and dearest, including family members, to get that deal. In 2005, when I was privileged to have my colleague's former job, I was invited to a Scandinavian country to go make a presentation on maritime safety and security. And part of that conference, they had a trade show outside where they were, displaying all sorts of toys. I'm not a military person, but like most males, I'm being gender insensitive here. I like toys, any gadgets. I like to see gadgets. So I was there, I was mesmerized. There was this loop going on the screen, and then a person comes out from behind the kiosk and says, "Do you like it?" Yes. "Are you interested? Would you like to know more?" "Of course." So he takes me around the back, and they had like a whole room set up in the back with big screen TV, plush couch, sat me down, put a 5-minute video, bells and whistles. And I thought, great. And he says, "Are you from Africa?" "Yes, I am originally, but I was traveling on a US passport." But I said, "Yes, I'm from Africa." Not a lie. True, right? He said, "Will your country like to buy this?" I said, "Isn't it expensive?" He says, "Oh, no, there are ways." And then the art of the deal kicks in. I was offered bribe. I was offered education from my kids through university, in any university I want. So if I were an African official, in a former life I was an economist. In the mid-90s, I was research director for a central bank, which is the equivalent of the Federal Reserve. As research director, I was one of the 8 most senior people at that bank, making good money, relatively. But my salary working at that central bank was, my monthly salary was less than what I earned 1 week when I was working at the World Bank before I went to take up that job. So, ask yourself this question. You're in that position. You have 3 or 4 kids, and college is paid. No questions asked. And you wonder why so many African countries sign bad deals. So it's not just China and Turkey, the corporate dimension as well. So this is this is true fact, happened to me. And I can't think of many honest, hardworking African professionals who would not have taken that deal. Because they weren't asking me to do anything particularly illegal. I was just supposed to be a door opener, to take this to my boss, the minister, and talk it up a bit. Ashish will tell you about all the associated costs, even if a country accepts it free of charge. The budgetary impact of that equipment or that system is disastrous. And the life cycle implications, forget interoperability, etc., just the life cycle implications in terms of money and manpower are ridiculous to think about. So corruption, I don't condone corruption in any shape or form, etc., but if we're going to be able to address it effectively, we really need to understand what it is. And Gary Becker's paper does a good job because he brings the rational choice debate, which forces us to think about 2 things: the anticipated gains and the costs and punishments. We need to have credible institutions and who are both resourced and empowered to do very difficult jobs. Because, if you take politics, for instance, and the issue of nepotism. Okay. The issue becomes one of, do we have laws that you could enforce that prevent it? That's the bigger issue, and you have institutions that could enforce the laws. That's where I would draw the line. It doesn't become like a value judgment, because politics all over the world, and even in our great country, it's all about making sure your constituencies are happy. Senators get deals for roads from nowhere to nowhere, or, yeah.
Sure.
It-
but, you know,
it's
you can make an argument in our own context that that's not okay.
Yeah, and in African context as well, and if you read a lot of the constitutions of African content, it is not okay. It's there that corruption shall be punished. And in many cases, legislatively more severely than we provide for. But then the issue becomes, are there courts that are independent and jails that could keep them?
But Raymond, wouldn't you say, and sorry to butt in, wouldn't you say that there's almost like two different realities? There's the formal reality and there's the informal reality. For example, as an African, you and I are Africans, right? If we happen upon $1 million, doesn't really matter how we got the $1 million. There might be an expectation on the part of our family members, of our friends, in fact, of the whole tribe, that we should share some of that money. And that pressure to get the money and share the money sometimes induces one to put his or her fingers where, in a formal sense, that would not be permissible. So the idea of using public monies for private ends is acceptable in many communities. Because if you make it, you have the responsibility to help those who are close to you.
But let's, I think you raised an important point, is that what do the laws provide for? And what happens in reality? Okay. The nepotism issue is slightly more nuanced, but the use of public funds, that's a little bit more categorical. And that's where the first point that Gary Becker mentioned is building integrity. Because there is a moral, it's more of a moral, you need to start from, people ask, where do you start from? And that you need that moral burden. And you need people who would, do the right thing, basically. Because it is expected, but it doesn't always happen. And if you don't have systems that ensure that that moral burden issue is addressed across the board, then it continues to be pervasive.